decade, my generation will also die. They will go away. Then who will take up the mantle? Who will take up the responsibility of carrying forward the torch of freedom for Tibet? You have to do it, no one else. And that is why I'm here to encourage you, but sometimes your attendance and your attention inspires us, thinking that, okay, we do have a younger generation who will be able to take up the responsibility in the years to come. Will you be willing to do that? Enthusiastic,
Nabalenge samalola ya samde leche de shuyin. Tarinye toni senge tawanga we che chukji resani meki ningdire. Tringe lenje serona geleze di nang. Kesa chelu nye toni senge tawanga we che junin. Upimi dikzugi benden sikong pempasiring cho. Ari Massachusetts ngati tongde Amos sanesu. Shungde samsi nangup. Amos puri jidi chokbe kudi o. Sane puri yongne sekong chola pipsu nene sabye shu yobare. Kapte pende sekong pempasiring choki. Puri shungye namla. Pöki kene kor inge to songshi nang yobade shamla sisi yoba shu gyutang. Sekong choki mangsola songshi nang yobade lenje sanro nang leze ngapja ngapju ngapdun nang gyobar sentupgire.
Hello. Pande singing major pembersary. Chodre de shunde something tiny with the pelliang. Arasane Somi on the end. Mix a king of Tundam circle. Tins of the Kus of Shuje, a two channel Sishu. The dinner that puts of the Pandesi young chalk, mixing it the PowerPoint that this ma soon I get a song that day in the Slash Mohab Chen, number some to you then to Intelia, Tonash, Chumshi, Chikasure, love to just not it. There was sugar, so that they attended and their cons young chiggy, soon on the some Italia, chick, Injicat on the focus, hardly a Tonya Chimbush, and now Nancy Shiada. Any our chums also get this. She knows she had any time Italia and she don't have to not again. It's to do genetic sense to channel.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think I'm to get Harjatari. Forget is again a shower. Is it done? Which one? Okay, and each again, should I speak in English? When you grow a little older, then you should be able to understand Tibetan, right? When we Tibetans speak to Tibetan, we should be speaking in Tibetan, ideally. But since it's important to, the very reason for communication is for you to understand what we have to say. So if we are not able to communicate what we have to say, then it doesn't make sense, right? So this time, I'll speak in English, and next time when you grow up a little bit, then we can speak in Tibetan. Last time I was here, a little more than a year ago, I was here for the first time as Sikyong. And this is my second visit. I promised during Ijidang. Okay, and Ijigena. Should I speak in English? When you grow a little older, then you should be able to understand Tibetan, right? When we Tibetans speak to Tibetan, we should be speaking in Tibetan, ideally. But since it's important to, the very reason for communication is for you to understand what we have to say. So if we are not able to communicate what we have to say, then it doesn't make sense, right? So this time, I'll speak in English, and next time when you grow up a little bit, then we can speak in Tibetan. Last time I was here, logic class, a little more than a year ago, I was here for the first time as Sikyong, and this is my second visit. I promised during the campaign last time that I will visit every Tibetan community 2 times in 5 years. Now we are scattered across more than 27 different countries. Tibetans are scattered in more than 27 different, in the United States alone we are in 28, 29 different states. So we try to reach out to the younger generation as much as possible, because now I'm about 58, 59 years old, and we are taking the responsibility now. And the generation that came before us were those who came from inside Tibet. My parents, your grandparents, they all came from inside Tibet, and the generation that came from Tibet were not as educated as we are today. Because in Tibet those days, only those people who were in monasteries, they understand, they were literate, but there were no normal schools like we have today in Tibet those days. So most of the Tibetans were illiterate, but their devotion to His Holiness was very strong. His Holiness Dalai Lama was very strong, and their commitment to serve the Tibetan people was very strong. So it's because of that generation that brought us up, our generation. Now, the responsibility of our generation is to make sure that you grow up as Tibetans, as proud Tibetans, and then be able to take up the responsibility in future for however long it takes. Because we have a Tibetan saying, hope for the best, prepare for the worst, meaning that we may be able to reach a negotiated solution with the Chinese government, and then Tibetans can go back to Tibet, right? That's hoping for the best. So till that does not happen, we have to keep struggling for our freedom, for the freedom of our brothers and sisters inside Tibet. And if you don't take up the responsibility in future, there is no one else who will take up the responsibility. So to take up responsibility, first you have to understand what the issue is, and be proud of being a Tibetan. So it's not just that you're a Tibetan, so you should be proud of it. There should be reason as to why you should be proud of being a Tibetan. Then you have to understand the basics of Tibet. So without understanding the basics, then you won't be in a position to explain about Tibet to other people, to your classmates, to your schoolmates, and others. So when I traveled around last time, I could not meet with you separately. We met with the general public, and then we had a talk at the UMass, and that was it. Because this time I was in Washington, D.C. for about 2 weeks, meeting with leaders at the Hill. And yesterday we were in New York, meeting with the board members of the Tibet Fund. And today we are here. Tomorrow we'll be in Ithaca, and then another 2 weeks in Toronto. Then I will go to Calgary, Vancouver, BC. There are 2 Tibetan communities in BC, one in the Victoria Island and in BC. Then I will travel to Japan, like that. So it's our responsibility to reach out to as many governments as possible and the Tibetan communities as possible to explain about Tibet and why Tibet is important, why freedom for the Tibetan people is important. So to be able to explain to other people, if you don't understand the basics of where Tibet is, how big Tibet is, what is the population of Tibet, and what are the geostrategic importance of Tibet and environmental importance of Tibet, not only for the Tibetans, but for the whole world, then you will understand. Then you will feel proud of being a Tibetan, and why it is necessary to preserve Tibetan language, Tibetan culture, Tibetan religion, way of life, and particularly Tibetan environment, Tibet's environment, because it impacts not only Tibet, but the whole region, right? So if you look at this map, this is a satellite. Now, these days, you have a lot of satellite maps. So from here, you can see that Tibet has a natural boundary. Tibet has a natural boundary because it's very high, right? So you can understand that Tibet is located in the central of Asia. This is Asia, and it's right in the middle of Asia. By its location itself, you can understand how geostrategically it's important, not only for Tibet, but all the neighboring countries. Now, when in your Sunday school, Saturday school, maybe you recite this prayer, right? For the long life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Anzu shendu kyolgu yorba, kari rawe kowe shingham, su pena dewa manu chungane, chene sungan tenzi jazu shabe siti padu tema sho slani anzu melam dungu yorba. We recite every morning in schools, in your daily lives, for the long life of His Holiness. And the first line is Kangri Rawe Korwe Shingham Dir. So what does that mean? In English, is the heavenly abode, land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. So Tibet is the only country which is described in this way, and this is how we describe our own land. The heavenly abode, the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. Now you have to explain how it is surrounded by snow mountain. It's not just enough to say Tibet is a land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. So if you look at this map, you have the Himalayas, which are the highest mountain range, which is the highest mountain range in the world, because Mount Everest is located here, between India and Nepal. And then the second highest, Kanchenjunga, is also here. So these are the Himalayas. This is one mountain range, snow-capped mountain. Then on the west, you have the Karakoram range. On the north, you have the Kunlun range. In east, you have series of mountain ranges. So that is how Tibet is surrounded by snow mountain ranges, right? 한국도 중국도 teacher. But Westerners started coming. It's not easy for people from outside to come into Tibet because you have to climb up so many mountains and down valleys and then up mountains and down valleys. So it was not possible for many people to come into Tibet. And of course, the neighboring countries of Tibet, like Nepal, China, Mongolia, Uyghurs, they have been there, and we have had a historical relation with our neighboring countries, right? But people from Europe, people from North America, the first American to come to Tibet was only in 1889, right? Very late. And the first European to come, there are a lot of stories about the first European to have come to Tibet in 13th century, but there was not enough proof that there was a European in Tibet those days. Then there were also stories about the first Europeans having crossed over Tibet to go back to Europe from China, and they were the Jesuit missionaries, Christians who want to spread Christianity in China. They are supposed to have crossed from China over Tibet and then go back to Europe. And that was supposed to have happened around late 16th century. Then 17th century, in 1626, the first Jesuits came to Tibet and they built a church in a place called Tsaparong. It's somewhere here. Tsaparong here, in the upper reaches of Himalayas. The first church in Tibet was built. And it was a Portuguese by name Antonio de Andrade who started this church, and there were other Jesuits who crossed over from India to Tibet through Bhutan those days, Kabal and one another guy. They also started another church in Shigatse, but the ruins of those churches are not there right now. So I read many books of people who have traveled to Tibet and wrote their memoirs. And many of the Christian missionaries, they report back to the original church in Europe. So those documents were there in Latin those days. Now it is being translated to English, and those materials are available for us to read. And earlier it was not there because none of us understand Latin. So in China, in late 18th, 19th century and early 20th century, there were missionaries called China missions, right? There were a lot of missionaries, and they have come up to the border of Tibet. And there was one person, I forgot his name, but I'll come up with the name later, the Shumanjini himself. In 1906, this person, a missionary who could speak Tibetan, his son also had a Tibetan name, later became the head of the Department of Asia in Washington University in Seattle. His father wrote this book called the Tibet Frontier Outpost in 1906, and one of the chapter was titled as Roof of the World. Maybe from that time, Westerners started referring to Tibet as the roof of the world. Now again, it's not enough to say Tibet is roof of the world. Now how Tibet is roof of the world, okay? So the average elevation, altitude you can see from here, Tibet has risen out of the tectonic shift between the Eurasian plate and the Indian plate, right? And this came up because of this tectonic shift. So the average elevation is about 4,880 meters, or about 16,000 feet, 16,010 feet, right, according to NASA. When I traveled to Japan, I asked the Japanese students as to which is your highest mountain. They say Mount Fuji, right? And Mount Fuji, the altitude is about 3,800 meters, 3,780 or 800 meters. So I told the Japanese, your highest mountain is like base camp in Tibet. You start climbing from there, right? So this gives you an idea about how high Tibet is. In New Zealand also the same thing. Their highest mountain is Mount Cook, also about 3,700, 800 meters. And that's like base camp. You start climbing from there in Tibet. Because of its altitude, they call it the highest plateau on Earth. There are several plateaus in the world, but this Tibet is the highest plateau. That is why it is called the roof of the world. And it's home to Mount Everest, which is about 8,800 meters or 29,029 feet. And then Tibet has an area of 2.5 million square kilometers. So it's about 30 times the size of Austria. I say 18 times the size of Japan. Tibet is huge. It's not a small place. One time I was asked by a Pakistani journalist as to which is bigger, Tibet or Bhutan. You need 100 Bhutans to make one Tibet, right? Tibet is very big, so you have to understand. And then if you understand the size of Tibet, then you also understand the geostrategic importance of Tibet. And it forms about 25% of China's landmass. China's landmass is about 9.7 million square kilometers. Right? And if you round it up, it's about 10 million square kilometers. Tibet is 2.5 million square kilometers, so it's about 25% of China's total landmass. So I already discussed a little bit about how this plateau came up, right? So because of the tectonic shift between the Eurasian plate and the Indian plate. This used to be called as the Gondwanas those days. And this is supposed to have this collision of the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate, because those were separate. Indian plate was separate, Eurasian plate was separate. Because of the tectonic shift, this is supposed to have happened about 50 million years ago. Now, according to Geological Society of America, this tectonic shift is still happening, and Himalayas is still growing by 10 millimeters every year. So 10 millimeters is almost same as noodle thick. It grows every year, right? And then, according to the scientific journal, human habitation on the Tibetan plateau dates back to about 30,000 years ago. So if you have new findings in future, it may go back to 40, 50,000, but as of today, according to scientific journal, the human remains on Tibetan plateau dates back to 30,000 years ago. So you can imagine that Tibetan civilization started from those times. Then now Tibet, environmental scientists refer to Tibet as the third pole The other two poles are North Pole and South Pole, right? And why they call Tibet the third pole? Because Tibet has the largest amount of glaciers and permafrost that feeds all these major rivers in Asia. That is why Tibet is called the third pole. So you have the largest reservoir of glaciers and permafrost outside the Arctic and the Antarctic. And according to UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, they say Tibet has about 46,000 glaciers, the largest in the world, right? And it holds about 14,500 cubic kilometers of glacial ice. So when this ice starts melting and the permafrost starts flowing, then it generates rivers across the Asian continent. And it's crucial for climate regulation, because people say that the jet streams that flow over the Tibetan plateau decides what's going to be climate in the adjoining regions. So it's not just the jet streams that flow over the Tibetan plateau, but also the impact of El Nino. El Nino is warming up of Pacifics. Combination of El Nino and the jet streams that flow over the Tibetan plateau decides climatic conditions, not only in Tibet, but around the surrounding countries. Now this is another picture. I was in, 2 years ago, I was in Brazil. Just before going to Brazil, I came across this article by a science journal, and it says that, see, Amazonia in Brazil area is called Amazonia because it's also called as the lung of the world because it has the largest forest, right? So Brazil is on the one side of the world and Tibetan plateau is on the other side of the world. Globe to see and these scientists found that, as reported by scientists in China, Europe and Israel in the scientific journal Nature Climate Change, despite being 20,000 kilometers away from each other, it has impact on the climate extremes in the Amazon rainforest directly affect those on the Tibetan plateau. So you can see how interdependent even climate is, not just on other matters, but the interdependence of the climate on one part of the world has its impact on other parts of the world. Researchers also use global near-surface temperature data over the last 40 years to map out a pathway from the Amazon to the Africa, to Middle East, and then to Tibet. And they found then that when it gets warmer in Amazon, then temperature also rises in Tibet. And when the rain increases in South American rainforest, then snowfall decreases here. So you can see this correlation, right? People in Brazil might think that, Amazon might have nothing to do with Tibet, or Tibetans might think that Tibet has nothing to do with Amazon, but it has impacts on each other. Just to show you how interrelated or interdependent we are in this world. Then Tibet is also called as the water tower of Asia. Water tower of Asia. Now again, why Tibet is water tower of Asia? How Tibet is water tower of Asia? So from the Tibetan plateau, because of the glaciers and permafrost, you have all the major rivers. This is the Yellow River. Yellow River in Tibetan is called Machu. It's not visible here, it's the last one. It's called Machu. Yellow River flows from Tibet and then into China. And then the other river is Yangtze, which is Dishu, that flows from Tibet into China. And these two rivers are the lifelines of China. Without these two rivers, China cannot support its 1.4 billion people. Right? And Chinese civilization also started on the Yellow River. So the cradle of Chinese civilization was established on Yellow River. Then you have the Mekong, which flows from Tibet into 5 countries in Southeast Asia: Laos, Vietnam, Burma, Thailand, and Cambodia. Right now, there are a lot of concerns about China building multiple dams on the Yangtze or on the Mekong, and downstream countries are not getting enough water. When there is excess of water in Tibet, they let it flow. Downstream countries have flood. When there is less water in Tibet, they put walls, build dams, don't let the water flow into the neighboring countries, so you have drought in these regions. So people's livelihood are being changed because of China's policies in Tibet on building multiple dams across all these rivers, not just one river. Okay? Then you have the Irrawaddy and the Salween flowing into Burma. Then you have the Tsangpo, which is called Brahmaputra, flowing from western Tibet to eastern Tibet. Then it takes a U-turn here to come into India. Now China is building a mega dam here, which is supposed to produce 2.8 times electricity than the Three Gorges Dam. Three Gorges Dam is the biggest dam in the world today. And this dam that China is planning will produce 2.8 times the hydroelectricity than the Three Gorges Dam. So you can imagine how high a dam China needs to build to produce that kind of hydroelectricity, and how much land is going to be inundated upstream, which will destroy so much flora and fauna that are very unique to the Tibetan region, in that particular region, right? And if something, and as I mentioned, the Tibet came out of the seismic shift, right, between the Gondwana and the Asian plate. So and we had earthquake here last December in Tibet, 7.1 on the Richter scale. There was earthquake in Afghanistan. There was earthquake in Burma. So all these areas are seismic zones. If something happens to this dam with a seismic shift, then all the water will flow downstream and people are going to die. In the state of Arunachal Pradesh in India, Assam in India, and Bangladesh. And these are very highly densely populated areas. Then you have the Ganges, which originates from the Indo-Tibetan border and flows into India. It's one of the most sacred rivers in India. Then you have the Sutlej and the Indus, which flows from Tibet, and it goes into India and then Pakistan. Today, this has become a major issue because there is escalation of relationship between Pakistan and India as we speak now. Before I came from India this time, there were 26 tourists were killed by terrorists in Kashmir. And because of that, now one of the steps that India has taken is that they are not going to let water flow into Pakistan. So water is becoming a weapon. The dam that Chinese government is planning to build here in this Tibetan area called Metok, in Pemako, they have already termed this as a water bomb. If the relationship between India and China goes bad, if China lets this dam flow, then it's going to be weaponization of water, okay? So all these countries that I mentioned, Pakistan, Nepal, there is Karnali here that flows into Nepal. So you have Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Burma, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and China. These are some of the most densely populated areas in the world, right? And people are dependent on Tibet's river for their livelihood. So some say that Third World War could happen because of water. If that is the case, then Tibet is going to be a huge bio hotspot. And then we are not just talking about water. We are talking about food security in future. We are talking about water security in future, which are going to be very, very important topics for you when you grow up. These are going to be subjects that you will learn more and more about the impacts of all this. So Tibet is source of 10 major rivers that flows into all these countries I mentioned. Impact of livelihood is estimated to be about 2 billion people. The rivers that flow from Tibet impacts about 2 billion people out of 8 billion people. So that's 1/4 of the world's population, right? And then you have it's very crucial for global food and water security, And then Tibet is also called the rainmaker. As I mentioned, the El Nino impact and the jet streams that flow over the Tibet decides which are going to be hot places in Tibet, then in India, where the depression sets in, and then the cloud sets in, and then how it rains. So rain is going to increase over the years because of the impact on the Himalayan, in the Tibetan plateau. And heat waves in Europe are also linked to the thinning of snow cover, because now there you have global climate change happening, right? In other areas of the world where the changes are happening, it's twice the speed on Tibet and thrice the speed on the other two poles, Arctic and the Antarctic. And this is one study done by the International Campaign for Tibet on the damming of Tibet's rivers by the Chinese government. So you have multiple dams on every single river before it flows into the other country, right? And these proposed dams in preparation, under construction, and operating. So you have all this, but this is not complete. So some of the estimate is since 2000, 193 hydropower dams have been built on Tibetan rivers. So the whole idea is produce hydroelectricity here and move it to eastern China, where there's too much industrialization. You must have heard that China is today known as the factory of the world because they manufacture about 30% of world's goods, right? And they need all this hydroelectricity for all the industries they have on the eastern coast of China. And 193 are located on 6 of the rivers and its tributaries, and then many more dams might exist that we don't know. So some estimate that the real figure could exceed 300 dams on Tibetan rivers. That's how China tries to control all resources, including water, which is very, very essential for human survival. And this is just to give you, when we speak about the geostrategic importance, if we go back to the yellow map, you can see that Tibet is located between China and India. Tibet has always remained as the buffer, political buffer between China and India over centuries, right? And today we are saying if there could be a peaceful resolution to the Sino-Tibet conflict, then Tibet can be the bridge for peace between India and China. So after China occupied Tibet, forcefully occupied Tibet in 1959, then this border vanished. But India still calls it Indo-Tibetan border, Indo-Tibetan border police, Indo-Tibetan border force. They have not changed it to Sino-Indian or Indian-Chinese border. They have not changed it. So that's why I keep telling the Indians also that this underlies India's position on Tibet to some extent. So here you can see how important it borders with Bhutan, borders with Nepal, then you have India, then you have China here, you have Burma on the south, then the Uyghurs on the north and Mongols in the north. So how Tibet is important geostrategically because of its location. Because China claims its right or its sovereignty over Tibet. Sometimes they say, oh, Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. Now, when is ancient times? Sometimes they say, oh, Tibet has been part of China since immemorial. Now, when is immemorial? We don't know, okay? China claims Tibet became part of China in 7th century. That is when King Songtsen Gampo, one of the first great religious kings of Tibet, married a Chinese princess. So they claim that just because the Tibetan emperor married a Chinese princess, Tibet became part of China. So in which case, the same emperor had a Nepalese wife also. So in which case, Nepal can also claim its sovereignty on Tibet. So China cannot prove that, right? And then they say, oh, Tibet became part of China in 13th century. Again, the question is, Tibet and Mongolia had relations much before the Mongols invaded China, and then it became the Yuan dynasty. Mongols invaded China, We had relations with the Mongols starting from mid-13th century, about 1247, right? But Mongol, the fifth Khan of Mongol, Kublai Khan, invaded China. This has little discrepancy here. Most of the historical texts say that it's 1271. 1271, Kublai Khan invaded China, and then China became part of the Mongolian Empire. We had relations with China, with the Mongols in 13th century, mid-13th century. So here, if you look at this, when China was being ruled by the Mongols, we had Sakyapas who ruled Tibet, right? And that was followed by the Pamadrupas for about 100 years. Then in China, the Mongols were dethroned by the Mings. Mings are real Chinese, Han Chinese, okay? And they ruled China from 1368 to 1644. During that period, we had our own dynasties here, Rinpoche and Devacangpas. And then the Qings are not Chinese, they are Manchus. If you watch Chinese Kung Fu movies, you will see that all the protagonists are Chinese and all the antagonists are Manchus. Because the societal perspective of the Chinese is that Manchus are not Chinese. So for that matter, Tibetans are also not Chinese. For that matter, Mongolians are also not Chinese. So there have been a lot of academic discourses within China as to who is a real Chinese. Is it only Han, the Chinese, or are the Mongols also Chinese? If they say Mongols are also Chinese, then Mongols invaded half of the world. Then they can claim half of the world as Chinese, right? So it's important to understand this historical comparative history between China and Tibet to understand how Tibet was independent, not ruled by China. Tibet was never ever directly administered by any foreign country till China occupied Tibet. Communist China occupied Tibet in 1950, okay? So this is just to give you an overview, and also I would highly recommend that you read these books. There was an earlier version called Tibet Brief 2020, written by Michael Van Wall Prague and his partner Nick Boltias. And this is the Indian version. Earlier it was called Tibet Brief 2020, and then you have a cover of the book like you are going to an eye clinic. His meaning was that Tibet's history is not understood well by the world, and after he wrote this book, the Tibetan history has become clearer. That's what he wanted to put, but every time you have to explain that title and the cover and all that. So this is an Indian publication, Indian version of the publication called Tibet Explained. Now, if you read this book, it will empower you to understand from a legal international perspective as to how Tibet was independent, right? From the Yuan to the Ming to the Qing, if you compare the Chinese history, and then from the Sakyapas to the Rinpoche, the Pamadrupas to Rinpoches and Devacangpas and the successive Dalai Lamas from 1642. Here, when I talk about history also, I also point out the difference between this and this. 1642, the fifth Dalai Lama became the political and spiritual leader of Tibet. 2 years after that, the Mings were overthrown by the Qings, right? So you can see these differences to prove how Tibet was independent. So this, if you can read, because I keep saying that if the present generation does not read Tibetan history, then who else will read Tibetan history? No one else will study Tibetan history. If we don't know our own history, then how do we fight about the legitimacy of Tibet? Explain to other people about the legitimacy and the sovereignty of Tibet to other people. Then there is another book which the English version should be coming pretty soon, and this is written by a Chinese professor, Professor Lao Hanxiang, and he referred to imperial Chinese historical records of the Yuan, of the Ming, and the Qing, and proves that Imperial China has never considered Tibet as part of China. And this is a very powerful argument. And this is not written in a historical perspective. It's written more on an argumentative position as to how Tibet was never considered part of China by Imperial Chinese themselves. So if you read these two books, then you will be in a very good position to be able to argue with anybody, whether it's a scholar or an activist, to explain how Tibet was an independent country. Okay? 제가 시시한 지금이라 야 망타나 야 디메징나 내주 망타나 야 고베냐 가라 유스만 단위에 디레샤. If you have questions, if you want to understand more, not just about what I spoke, but the very reason we are here this time in the United States is because there was a cut in financial assistance by the US government globally, everywhere, and we also became a part of that. We became a collateral damage because we spent about US $40 million by the Central Tibetan Administration or the Tibetan government in exile, and out of that, 14 million comes from the United States. So that's about 35% of our budget. And out of 14 million, 2 million have been restored back from PRM, a department under the State Department called Population, Refugees and Migration, which deals with much of health care projects in India and Nepal. The other 12 million, now it has gone down to zero. So we were, Konamjela, our representative is here in Washington, D.C., the International Campaign for Tibet. We discussed that maybe it's a good time for me to come here and meet with the people on the Hill to explain about why support for Tibet is important, not only for the Tibetans, but in the interest of the United States, right? Its security, its prosperity, and all that. So we have been meeting with a lot of people on the Hill this time. How many of you have participated in Lobby Day? Yama, Lobby Day, Yamshu Nanyunga Yorbe. So next time, you have Lobby Day coming up now in June on 24th and 25th. So if you are interested, you can always join Lobby Day, go to Washington, D.C., meet with your elected representatives and explain to them about Tibet and several of the issues. One of the issues that we are raising this time is that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is reaching 90 this year on July 6th. So we are going to celebrate His Holiness' birthday as a year of compassion. Because as we speak today, there are more than 54 violent conflicts going on around this world. So the message of peace, message of non-violence, message of compassion is very, very relevant. That's rooted in ancient Indian wisdom and expounded by His Holiness' messages through the world, right? So the message of compassion is very important. So we are going to celebrate from July 6th this year, next year, July 5th, one full year, we are going to celebrate as Year of Compassion. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has, over the last so many decades, have visited more than 60 countries and have been honored, invited by more than 300 organizations and institutions. And if we reach out to each one of these organizations and institutions to organize at least one program, that itself will be 300 programs. And then there will be a series of programs being organized in different countries and in Dharamsala also. So we are requesting the Congress people at the Hill to pass a resolution on His Holiness' 90th birthday. That is one. Then there is, United States is the only government that has a law on Tibet called the Tibet Policy Act of 2002, which has been amended to Tibet Policy and Support Act of 2020, and it has a sunset clause, meaning that it will end after 5 years. So we have to reauthorize that in the Congress. That is another thing we are requesting. The third thing is to get the funding back, the 12 million back, or part of it back. And then the fourth thing is you can also take part in this in your social media posts also. On May 17th is the 30th anniversary of the abduction of the Panchen Lama. We still don't know whether Panchen Lama is alive or not, So we are requesting members to post on the social media about the missing pension lama. So these are some of the issues that we have taken up with the Congress, and Congress members, whomever we met, seem to be very enthusiastic. So on the funding part, we are still working. We met with State Department, we met with so many leaders. I don't want to mention all the names right now. Maybe in the next session, when I talk to the general public, I will mention all the names as to what we did in the last 2 weeks in Washington, D.C., doing all those things. Okay? Yeah, I'm going to watch it again. See, every time we go, we try to encourage the younger generation to understand Tibet, because now you are citizens of the United States, just like yourself. There are so many Tibetans in other parts of the world, spread across 27 different countries. They have become nationals of those countries. They understand the system. So if you understand a little more about what is happening in China, and what Chinese government is doing to Tibet and the Tibetan people, and then also understand global politics and how it impacts the Sino-Tibet conflict, then you would be the best person or best advocate for Tibet. That's also reason why we started this platform called VTAC. It's called Voluntary Tibet Advocacy Group. Right now there are about 700, 800 Tibetan volunteers who have joined this group. Annually, we organize International Youth Forum in Dharamsala. You all are welcome to participate, not necessarily in 1 year, but every year we'll be doing this, inviting 100 young leaders from all over the world to come to Dharamsala for conference, to have meetings there. And when you go back, if you manage to take up the responsibility, then most of the students who come for these conferences are between the age of 20 to 30, and if they live for another 40 years, then we are preparing leadership for the next 40 years. And you should be an active participant in all these activities. Because I'm 48, as I mentioned, I'm 58, 59, another decade, my generation will also die. They will go away. Right? Then who will take up the mantle? Who will take up the responsibility of carrying forward the torch of freedom for Tibet? You have to do it, no one else. Right? And that is why I'm here to encourage you, but sometimes your attendance and your attention inspires us, thinking that, okay, we do have a younger generation who will be able to take up the responsibility in the years to come. Will you be willing to do that? Enthusiastic, and in my position as Sikyong, I traveled around the world. I've visited about now 27, 28 different countries. I've visited all the Tibetan communities around the world. And I visit every Tibetan settlement, every Tibetan camp to meet with the elder generation, to thank them for the contributions they made in their lifetime. Like Bala here, right? He's 82 years old. Their generation have worked very hard to bring us up. Now it's our responsibility to bring you up, and it's really your responsibility to bring up the next generation. Okay? Thank you. You can ask about anything. Was it helpful, useful?